There's a lot of things that we can do within a single component. And in this section, we're going to learn what all those things are. So what questions will be answered throughout this module? Well, we'll ask ourselves how we can define our data models for our components. How do we put in our customers' orders or heroes or villains? Functional logic is key to all these applications, so we'll also learn how we can create functions or methods inside of components, and those can run our custom logic. Now, when a component starts up, there's different events that we may want to tap into, and maybe when it cranks back down. We'll look at the different life cycle inside the component and how we can access it. Sometimes we need to be able to define custom properties that can react to other property changes. And of course, sometimes we want to run custom logic when a model changes too. So maybe when a certain data property like a customer changes, we want to run some asynchronous logic. And finally, there's going to be a lot of times where you want to be able to format date for display on the screen for the users. So we'll learn how we can do that within a component. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive in. Perhaps the most important piece of a component is the data itself. So let's learn about the data models and how we can define them. We've already seen the data function inside of a component. So inside of our heroes view, we might have something where we create hero's first name or last name. These are properties or models that the view's reactivity system can see. Well, what does that mean? View has this reactivity system which reacts to, or basically keeps an eye on all these properties, these models, and when they change, it knows about them. So when a value changes, the component reacts. And the component can update to match these values. So we might have a data function like this, and the data function returns a function. So here we've got the data model. We want to return a function, and that's a best practice you can find in the View Style Guide on their docs. And then we always want to define the properties or the models that we want to use in the component. So even when there's no initial value for them, we need to define these so View's reactivity system can keep an eye on them. Think of it this way. When View starts up, it looks at all the properties in the data model so it knows what to keep an eye on. Then you can add or change values in it as you go. So let's dive into our demo and add a data model to our heroes component. Here we are inside of the folder number 5, interacting within a component, and we can see begin and end. We're going to go to the begin view heroes. We'll right click and open in the terminal. And the first thing we want to do is npm install. Remember, our shortcut is npm I. This will install all the dependencies that we need. Now we're going to be living inside of this component called heroes view again. Now the npm install worked, I'm going to get rid of this bottom panel, and I'm going to get rid of the left panel by hitting Control B or Command B. So first we have this template up here, and that's going to show our heroes. And then we have our data down below inside the script tag. First, you'll see a red underline here because we have some data that we're hard coding or explicitly configuring inside of our component. And we're not using it yet, so it's complaining, but we'll use it. And then here we have our component with a couple things already defined. We'll look at these more in a bit. We'll do that by going to F1 or the Command-Shift-P to get to the command at the top of VS Code. Then we'll type in toggle, and then panel, and you can see the bottom there. And you'll notice at the top it shows Command-J on the Mac, which I'm using, is a shortcut that we can use to open it back up. And we're going to run npm run serve. And once it's running, we'll click on this link. Opens up the app, and we get a big white page. Now we're going to open the developer tools here because we have an error. Now this app has an error when it starts up. It's saying the property or method heroes is undefined. The problem here is that we don't have any data yet. So without data, we're trying to bind to things, and those things cannot be bound yet. So for example, if I look at the top in the template, we're going to see heroes are being bound. Heroes length, an array of heroes, and we haven't yet created those. So let's do that now. Now inside of our component down here, I'm going to go down past line 116. I'm going to use a snippet. Now we installed these snippets earlier in the course. If you didn't do so, if you click on this square icon over here, and then you type in view, you'll see View VS Code Snippets by Sarah Drasner. Those are the ones that I'm using here. If you're not using the snippets, you can type this out longhand. But by doing it like this, we say vdata, and then we hit tab, you'll notice we get the data function out of the box. Now first, we need a heroes data model. We're going to initialize that to an empty array. Next, we're going to need a selected hero. We'll set that to undefined. And finally, we'll need a message. And that message by default is going to be empty string. Now, once we save in here and we go back to the browser and we refresh the page, we should see 0 errors. Now, there's no data yet because, well, we don't have any heroes. But now we can see we have a data model here, and that's what's making things work. So if we simply just said our heroes right there, because we have that constant up here of all of our heroes, and we come back, now we can see all the heroes in our list, like that. The final thing to take a look at is if we've installed the other tool that we had early in the course, which is the View Chrome Developer Tools. We can then open those up in the upper right. We can click on that, and then we can just hover over our different components. So I hover over heroes, and notice what's showing up right here. If I close down the console, we can see there's the data, and we can see the objects in that data. You can actually edit them, delete them, or just add new ones. So for example, I could delete Madeline right there. And then when I go back to my list up here, you'll see it's not there anymore. So let's refresh the page. We'll put everybody back in. We come back over here. We can edit an object. We can change the name of this particular character right here from Landon to, let's say, we'll call this person Jim. So this is a nice debugging tool that you can use with Vue, and it really helps as you're building these applications. So now we've learned how to create our data model, use Vue snippets to do so, and also how we can debug the data model using the Vue developer tools. Perhaps one of my favorite features of Vue is how it enables us to create reactive properties or properties that can calculate their values. These are called computeds. Let's take a look at how they work. A computed property is created inside of the component, and it's going to fire when any dependency value changes. Now, what's cool about this is that it doesn't fire all the time. It only fires when those dependency values change, and it caches the values based upon the dependencies. So it's only going to reevaluate when any of those things change. Here's an example. We create a computed inside of our component, and we're going to call this one full name. And we're just taking the first name and the last name of two different models and putting them together with a space. So you can do whatever you want inside these computeds where you calculate things. In this case, we have two dependencies, first name and last name. And when either one of those changes, the computed value will reevaluate. And then we can bind to the full name. Now, this is a default way to create a computed, but you can also use getters and setters. So in this case, we might have a very similar one where we've got a first name and a last name. We create a full name out of it. In this case, we've got a getter here where we compute that value and we put the space between them. And then we could have a setter. Now the setter could be used to modify the first and last name. Imagine that we bound this full name into an input box and somebody started typing into it. Well, if we did that, we need a way to change the value. This is where a setter could help us. Well, now it's time to add a computed to our heroes component. Here's the running application that we have. When we select Ella, notice her first name shows here. Maybe we want to show the first and last name. So let's create a computed to do that. Well, let's go to the code and we'll search for where first name is displayed. So on line 30 here, we're going to change first name selected hero to full name. You might be tempted to do that on the selected hero, but we don't want to do this for every single one, just for the selected one, so we can have one property and that's it. Now let's scroll down. Here's our object, and we'll use the snippets once again to type in vcomputed. We're going to call this full name to match what we typed up top. And it's not going to be data, it's going to be this.selectedHero.firstName. That's our first property. We will put this whole thing inside of the backticks because we're going to use template strings here. So let's make the first name, and then we're going to do space, and then the last name. So again, this.selectedHero.lastName. And you should be getting IntelliSense for these. If we flip back to our application, we'll refresh to make sure we've got the latest changes. We'll click on Ella, Madeline, Haley, and Landon. And we can see the full name is right there. If we go back down into our data, we'll see down here we've got our selected hero, and we can even see the computeds being calculated there. Now if we change Landon's first name to John, now we're going to see John shows up here as well. And that's how the computeds work. There will be times where you're going to want to tap into the lifecycle of a component. We do that through the lifecycle hooks. Let's take a look at how these work. When the view instance is created, the first hooks that run are before create and then created in that order. At this point, the DOM is not available, and that's important, so we can't manipulate anything inside the template. But we can use this opportunity to go off and hit a third-party API or a custom API to go get our data. So I like to do this in the created lifecycle hook. And then the next ones that fire are before mounted and mounted, and they're just exactly what they sound like. This is when the DOM is mounted. I like to use the mounted lifecycle hook for interacting with third-party components. So if it's a component that's not necessarily built for Vue, maybe it's a jQuery UI component, for example, or just plain old vanilla JavaScript. Sometimes you need to be able to go grab that code and then mount it to someplace specific in the DOM. The mounted event is a great place to do that. Now let's say our data changes. We just learned about the data model, and sometimes they change, right? So if that data changes, then there's other hooks that are going to fire. There's before update and then updated. We can tap into those, and then of course when a component goes away, there's going to be before destroy and destroyed. That's for doing any cleanup that we might have. Taking a closer look at created, because we'll use this one a lot. Inside of a component, it's going to be invoked when that component is created, of course. We'll use this a lot to go fetch our data. Now you could do your fetches inside of mounted. It's really up to you. I happen to prefer and recommend using created to do this. Why? Because it's earlier. All the templates in the virtual DOM are not yet mounted, nor are they rendered. So that's really important. So we can't manipulate anything in those templates yet. So we might have a created event that says, go get my heroes, calling some service, and then asynchronously when it's done, it brings back the heroes and we set it to our data model. Now let's go add the created event to our app so we can go get some heroes and then load them. Here's our component, and we'll minimize what we have so far. And let's create the created right down here. Now all you have to do is type that in, and if you like, you can use the snippets again, and you can do v created. And we haven't got anything to call it just yet. But let's map this out. We'll create a few methods. Now methods are custom logic that we can run. We have a couple that come out of the box here with this sample. We'll get to these in a moment, things like canceling and saving. Let's add a couple of methods. The first one is we want to have a method that goes and gets some data. I'm going to call this one getHeroes. Now I want getHeroes to return back the heroes that we have. Now we call these our heroes up on the top of our code. But I'd like to simulate that it's actually hitting a network. So we're going to make this go and wait a second and a half before it does it. To do this, we're going to return a new promise. And with the promise, we have this resolve parameter, and it runs this function here. And the function we're going to run is a set timeout. So when this timeout runs, it's going to resolve to the heroes, and we're going to give it a 1500 millisecond wait time. And then we'll get rid of the return down below. So what we're really doing is just returning the heroes after a second and a half. And this makes this function asynchronous. So we're going to go ahead and make this defined as async. Now later in this course, we'll learn how we can actually hit an HTTP backend to go get our APIs. But for now, we'll just fake it till we make it. Next, we're going to have another async function called loadHeroes. Now loadHeroes is going to prepare the screen for getting the heroes. First, we're going to wipe out the current heroes array. Then we're going to set our message on the screen. And we've got this message for notifications. I'm going to say, getting the heroes. Hold your horses. Or please be patient. A little bit nicer, huh? And we'll do this dot heroes. And we're going to equal await. And then it's going to be this dot get heroes. So the async await pattern is working where await says await this asynchronous operation. And then when you're done, set it to heroes right here. And then we're going to set this message equal to empty string. So we're going to call load heroes, which wipes out the heroes, puts a message in the screen, waits for a second and a half to get the heroes, gets them, sets it to the data model, and then wipes out our message. So we want to call load heroes inside of created. So we'll call this dot load heroes just like this. Now one last thing, created is going to go get those heroes, but remember in the data, we'd already initialized it to some heroes. So let's wipe those out, put an empty array back in there. So the sequence of events before we reveal this in the UI is that the app starts up, the component gets created. There's no heroes, so there's nothing to display. Created gets called, load heroes gets called. It goes out and gets the heroes, but it takes a second and a half, and then it wipes out the message. So there should be a slight delay. Let's flip to the application and let's load it. And there we see our delay, and then the heroes come across the wire. And we've got our heroes on page. We'll do that one more time. Notice we've got a second and a half delay, and then they come in. We've just seen how we can tap into the lifecycle hook for created to make an asynchronous call and get our data. Do you always feel like somebody's watching your properties? Well, in Vue, they actually are. In Vue, there's the reactivity system, which is watching your models. But what if you want to watch a property? We can do that too. There's these things called watchers that we can use inside of our components to react to data changes. We create them like this inside of a watch section. And we name the value over here, hero, the same as the reactive value that we're going to be watching. So in this case, we're watching the hero model. And then this function accepts the new and the old value. So this is going to be really cool for any time we want to tap into these model changes, maybe even for asynchronous operations. Somebody changes the hero, and then we can run some logic to see maybe if it was a valid change. So the way this works is we react when the model changes, and then we can call our own custom logic. Now what happens when we have a dotted object.property type value? Something like this, where selected hero.cape counter, because all heroes need capes. In this case, when we've got a dotted property, we just wrap it with quotes like this. And optionally, we can tell it to run immediately, or the default is false. If we say immediately true, that means it's going to run this watcher right out of the gate, whether there's a value change or not. And in that case, we also have to pass in the handler. Let's go add a model for how many capes each hero has, and then we'll watch that with a watcher. Here on line 56 in our application, we've got a description field. We're going to add another one right below it, a different field. Instead of description, we're going to make this one be a cape counter, like this. And we'll make the description look a little nicer there. Now we don't yet have this property in our model, so we have to go add that. We'll scroll back down to our model and we can see this is our list. And I'm going to use a little bit of multi-cursor magic inside of VS Code so I can change all four of these at once. I'm going to highlight the word last name and colon like this. Then I'm going to use Command D to selectively get all four of them. Now you can see my cursor is moving around. I'm going to go to the end of the line. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to type in cape counter. And we'll set them all to 1 to start, like that. And then I'll hit escape to get out of the multi-cursor. You can also type these one at a time. And we'll change the values for everybody. Ella has 1 cape, Madeline has 3, Haley will have 2, and we'll give Landon 0. Now notice there's some logic already inside this code. We have a method down here called handle capes. Based upon the number of capes that we have, we're going to put a different message for the cape message. Now this means we need to have a cape message somewhere in our model. And we don't currently have that. So we go back up to our data, and after a message, we can put in cape message. And we'll start that one off as blank. Remember, we have to initialize it to some value. Now we have to have a place to display the cape message. So let's go back to our cape counter up top right here. And right below this field, we'll add another field. So let's copy that whole thing. And then we'll repeat it. Instead of cape counter here for the label, we're going to type in cape message. We'll do these one at a time just so we're careful. This will show the cape message. Now instead of an input, we'll delete that input. We're going to put another label in here because this is going to be read-only. Now this label is going to be a class of input that's just for styling. And then we're going to give it a name. That's going to be the cape message. And inside of there, we're going to put the cape message right here with interpolation. Now it's not going to display anything quite yet because there's nothing setting that cape message. We've got that function that handles the capes, and we need it to change and run anytime the cape counter changes. So we need to watch it. Well, let's go back down to our code, and we'll minimize our heroes again. There's our data, our computed, our created, our methods. Notice we can see the structure right here. And then we can use vWatcher with the snippets, and we get one of two. Notice as I'm scrolling through them, you get different data on the right. On the right-hand side, vWatcher shows it gets a very simple watcher. If I go to vWatcher options, you're getting all the data there. We're going to choose that one here. And then we're going to say selected hero, because that's what we're watching, dot cape counter. Now remember, that's a dotted property, so we got to wrap that with quotes. We're going to say immediate true. We're only going to watch one property. It's not going to be deep. Deep would let us watch nested properties. And then we've got a handler. Now we're not using the new or old value yet. That's why they're red. And we'll call our this handle capes. which remember is going to pass in the new value, and then it's going to set that Cape message. We're not using the old value yet, but just to show what those values do, let's console log it. And we'll use a template string here to say watcher is evaluated, and we'll show the old value and the new value. So now we're saying that the watcher is going to keep an eye on selected hero Cape counter. We have to make sure that that property exists, and it's going to run immediately. So right out of the gate, it's going to run this. And then every time the Cape counter changes, it'll rerun it to set that handle the capes method, which again, handle the capes is what's going to set that message up. Before we flow to our code, let's go take a look at the template that we created. So you've got the Cape counter up here, and that's an input. And notice it's bound to the selected Cape counter. And just to make this a little bit easier on us, we'll make this be of type number, so that input only accepts numbers. And then when that's going to be watched and when it changes, it's going to automatically update the Cape message right below it. We should expect to see that message. Now, if we flip back to our app, we can see it here. And on the dev tools, we're going to open those up and open the console by hitting escape. We can see the watchers are starting to evaluate, but there's nothing there yet. We hit Ella there, and we can see the old value is undefined, the new one is 1. And then I can hit the up arrow and notice the Cape message will change and the console messages on the right will change. And there we go. So 4, you can never have enough capes. 2, you always have a spare. 1 is all I need. And 0's, where's my cape? If we select somebody else, we can see those up here as well. And we just learned how to run and create a watcher. Quite often, you're going to want to be able to take a value and then display it in a different way on the screen in the component. We can create custom filters to do this with Vue. Let's take a look at how. So inside of a component like the Heroes component, we could define a local filter, and then it might be called something like capitalize. And it's a function that accepts a value. The value is whatever it's bound to in the template. So in the template, we might apply it like this. First name is our model, and then we're calling the capitalize filter. So what we do is say first name, pipe, that signifies a filter is coming, and then the name of that filter. And this will pass the value of first name to the value parameter over on the left, which will then capitalize it. Now you can chain filters too. So if we have first name, we can pipe it to capitalize, and the result of that can be piped to another filter called reverse. Sometimes you need arguments to your filters. You can do that as well. Let's say we had some date value. We could pipe that to a filter that we create called myDateFilter. And the first thing passed in, of course, will be some date, but the second thing would be the format. Now these are filters that are defined in the component itself, because that's what this module is all about, talking about what we can do inside the component. But you can also define filters globally. You might want to do this if you want to define it one place and use it everywhere. Now when you do this, make sure it comes before the Vue instance, because what you have to do is import Vue, and then do Vue.filter, and then name the filter, and then give it the function. And if you do that right at the top of your application, somewhere in the beginning of the chain, could be an app view as one option, then every component you have would have access to this filter called capitalize. Now it's time to go create a filter for our application for our heroes. Flipping back to the code, let's go right below the description. We're going to add a new field in here for origin date, because every hero has an origin story. So we're going to change the description here to origin date. And we'll make the label say origin space date. Now this input is going to be of type date. So we'll make that change here. That's our HTML type. And then right below the input, we're going to create a p tag that's going to have a class called comment. That's going to format that paragraph tag. And we're going to say my origin story began on, and then show the date. Now, of course, we don't have an origin date quite yet. So let's go to our model and we'll add one. Scrolling down, we can see that we've got our structure of our component again. Data computed, created, methods, and watch. And here's our heroes. We're going to add an origin date just like we added a cape counter to everybody. So I'm going to use the multi-cursor again to get all 4 of those. Hit enter, do origin date like this. Now we're going to create a new date object, and we'll enter different dates for each hero. Now we're trying to bind a date value up into the input. The input box for JavaScript requires a specific format. So we're going to need to format our dates to do this binding. So let's go create that format style. First, let's minimize the heroes. And on top of this, we'll create a constant. And we'll call this our input date format. Now, once we have this format, we need something to actually do the formatting. Now, there's a great library called datefunds, which allows us to do date manipulation. So I'm going to pull that into here so we don't have to do pure JavaScript manipulation. We're going to open up our terminal down below. Now notice the app is still running. I'm going to hit the splitter pane over here on the right. I'm going to open a second terminal. Now we're going to run npm install datefunds like this. This is going to go pull this library in so we can use it within Vue. This is showing us we can pull external libraries into our application and use them. Once we're done, I can type exit in that second terminal because I don't need it and hit the X. Now that we have that, we need to import the code for datefunds. So we're going to do import, and we're going to get a function in just a moment from datefunds like this. And what are we going to get? If we go inside the curlies, we should be able to get a list of IntelliSense in here. If you don't see that list, if you hit Control Space, you'll see it here. We want a function called format. If you're not seeing that list at all, maybe you didn't run the npm install for datefunds or it didn't work for you, so go ahead and give that a try again. Now that we have those two, it's telling us we're not using them. So let's go down to the origin dates. And again, I'm going to show you a neat trick with the multi-cursor. And I'm going to zoom out just for a moment so you can see all four at the same time. I'm going to highlight origin date, and I hit Command D 4 times, so I've got the cursor everywhere. I'm going to apply this format function right here. I'm going to say format, pass the new date in. I'm going to say use the input date format we just created, just like that. So now we're formatting all those dates using this string. If we flip back to our running application, we should see the app. We'll refresh it. Now we click on Ella. We should see the formatted date right down here for Ella. And notice the origin story is not showing up properly yet. If we click over on the heroes, we can see that each of the heroes happens to have the origin date formatted properly for us, even though it's showing up differently inside the input box because that's how it displays them. But now let's go back to our code and take a look what's happening with the origin date up in that paragraph tag we created. So notice we had a typo here where it said select hero. Now we can type selected hero and that origin date should show up, and we flip back to the code and it just appears. Now what if we didn't want to show it this way? This is where a filter comes into play. What we want to do is display this in a different format. Let's flip back to our code. We'll create yet another format. Now I'll zoom back in a little bit so we can see this. Let's create a new constant here called display date format. We'll create a 3-letter month, a 2-digit day, and then a 4-digit year. And what are we going to actually do with that? Now we're going to create a filter. So let's minimize our heroes. And just like we have all these other sections, we're going to come down here and use V filter as our snippet. We're going to hit tab. We're going to call this filter short date. We can really call it anything we want, but that's the function name I want. We'll keep the parameter called value. That's fine. And instead of just doing value, we're going to do format the value using the display date format that we created. So now we'll have a single function that'll format it based upon what we have. So how do we apply this? If we go find our origin date again, we can see it up here in our paragraph tag. We simply put the filter at the end, and now we just put the name of the filter, just like that. So now we flip back to our application and we select somebody. We should see that the data is formatted the way we wanted, just down here. And that's how easy it is to create your own filter and import other libraries to use in your components. In this module, you learned about the different tools you can use inside your component, including how you define your data models with the data function, how we can use methods to create our own custom logic, both synchronous and asynchronous functions, how we can tap into lifecycle hooks like created to go fetch our data, or mounted to talk to third-party UI components, and then mount them on the DOM. And then computed properties allow us to fire whenever a dependency changes and do things like full name or basically any custom properties that aren't in the data model but are based on that data model. And then when we need to do something a little more custom, we can use a watch to execute that logic whenever the data model changes. And finally, we can display data using filters. And keep in mind that transforms the output, not the model itself. So we learned how to create these data models, perform these operations when changes happen to our data, tap into those lifecycle and format data, but we also learned how to pull in third-party libraries like date-fns, which allows us to tap into other functionality from third-party libraries to really expand what we can do inside of our components. It's very common for us to have a lot of components in our applications, so it becomes really important to understand how we can communicate between those components. So what you'll learn in this module is the answers to these questions. How do we create a parent and child component relationship? We've got two components. How do they talk to each other? Then how do we pass values from the parent down to the child? And then from that child,